Hey everyone, welcome back to Citywide Bytes. I'm your host, Max Bowen. And for this episode, we're talking comics, the thing that I love the most. I'm joined by Shawn Hainsworth. He's the founder of SHP Comics, and we're going to talk all about how this company came to be. We're also going to dive into their soon to be released title, Zicky, Wrath of the Rat King. This one's more of a children's title with themes of imagination, family, and loyalty. And we're going to talk all about the team behind this, the story behind the story, and give you a little advice about launching your own comic. Enjoy. Okay, Shawn. Well, first off, man, just want to say thank you so much for joining me. Just checking out your website and your company. It's very exciting to see all the different things you got going on. But for those who are kind of new to SHP, what's the company and how did it get started, and what's the overall goal here?
Yeah, so SHP started in 2021. Really we're calling ourselves Comics on the Edge, whatever that means. What that means to me is that we're trying to create stories that are different, cross-genre stories or stories from a perspective that you haven't heard before, something that stands out on the shelf, and tells the story in perhaps a different way. So for example, Zicky is a manga Western mashup. It's an all ages title, but there's a lot of nods for adults, a lot of humor that is going to go over the head of a child. But I think that's totally fine. Like when I was a kid, I read things that were way over my head and I didn't care as long as it was a good story and I went along. And then, later maybe you appreciate all those things. Our other titles, I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but Woodstock is a vampire at Woodstock, and so we're really trying to hit that sweet spot between horror and comedy. Shaun of the Dead is the best example of that for me. I mean, a movie that just was pitch perfect in terms of both being funny and embracing the sort of tropes of a zombie movie. I laughed, I cried. I just loved that movie, and I think that there is a sweet spot for horror and comedy, but it's a tough one to hit. And with vampires and hippies, we had a good shot of going at it. So that's really our thing. The other thing is we also want to embrace on the literary end of comics. We just acquired just a really great collection of horror comics, Tales of the Macabre by a Spanish artist from the 1970s. And it's Poe and it's Lovecraft, and it's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and there is an adaptation of Kafka's The Metamorphosis in there. So this is classic horror done in a classic style that's reminiscent of the EC style of horror in the 50s. And yet these are more literary stories, and we're trying to really stick with the language. So once again, hopefully things you haven't seen before. Comics on the Edge, whatever
I
that is.
like that as like a company slogan. I think it's also a very like comics like '90s thing to say, because like back then they're all trying to be so like edgy and kind of break like new ground. So I think it's very fitting. But what's your own background in comics, Shawn? How did you first get like into comics, and what led you to saying, you know what, I'm going to start my own company?
Yeah. So I was sort of comics adjacent for a while. I was born in the 60s. I was a Mad Magazine kid. My older brothers, no one in my family read comic books. I sort of got into, as a National Lampoon kid, that sort of thing. I started to become aware of comics sort of in the late 70s. I was not the kid with stacks of Marvels and DCs. But there were two books that really kind of, shook me, and said, "Hey, you need to pay attention to this." One was Mouse, just because it was so extraordinary, and I just could not believe the depth of storytelling and emotion in that book, and it could only have been told the way it was told. Also, within Mouse, Spiegelman has a short he wrote called "The Prisoner," which is about his mother's death. And that was so I love that little short. That led me down the rabbit hole a little bit into Raw and a lot of what was going on with, truly alt comics in the 70s, where people were really, where the medium was just exploding in all kinds of directions. And then the other one was Watchmen. Yeah, and Watchmen, was two things for me. It was both Alan Moore's writing was just so spot on to me. It was so amazing. It was so layered. It was so dense. And it took the superhero genre and spun it. I was like when things were spun a little bit, right? And spun it. I loved Rorschach. And it also made me go, wow, in terms of the way, Dave Gibbons, the way stories could be told visually in sequential art. I was not aware of the sophistication of the medium until that book. Now, I'm not saying, there was the sophistication of the medium has been baked in since the beginning. I was a latecomer, but I got it, and I went, "Whoa, wow, that is just awesome." And so then I started paying a lot more attention to comics and reading more comics. And then why did I want to open my own comic shop? This is something I ask myself, and my wife asks me frequently, which is often phrased as, "What the he double hockey sticks are you doing?" Right?
Right.
Yeah, so I've always been a writer, because I had was it was comics adjacent, had more of a film background, and I made a bunch of documentaries in the 90s. So I was experienced in filmmaking, had gone to a bunch of film festivals. So I was writing screenplays along the way. And I sort of had an aha moment I was at the Austin Film Festival in 21 with Woodstock as the screenplay. And I was walking around and I realized no one's going to make this the way I want to make this, right? I mean, even if I sell this, I just am, kiss it goodbye. Goodbye. Take my script and do whatever you want with it. And, maybe give me a pat on the back. And I was like, I don't want that. This is my story and I want to tell it in a, it's a very Zicky thing to say. It's my story and I want to tell it. So how can I tell it if, and particularly with Woodstock, like you've got, historical references and all this other stuff. How, there's no way I could produce a film like that. There's no way I could produce anything other than the short. So, and it just kind of clicked, like do it as a graphic novel. Or, a series of comics that becomes a graphic novel. And I found Felipe Kroll, who I think is just an extraordinary artist, and one who, once again, his stuff does not look like a lot of stuff on the shelf, which I like. Um, and we were off to the races. I had so much fun. It was so creatively satisfying. I ended up making a short film out of one of our titles, Aerotech. And, once again, film is like 15 people in a room and, the clock is spinning and the money is draining. And it's a very different process to just working with an artist is just the most kind of pleasant creative arrangement I can imagine. And so, yeah, totally hooked. And here I am like 5 books later.
I love it. I love
Yeah.
it. Um, I also agree with you that about comics having like a great story because I think people kind of assume that it's all like, oh, smash, bam, pow, violence galore. But no, there are some titles that have an incredible depth of story that could be easily like a Netflix series or a movie. They have like that kind of structure there too. For me, I think Giant Days is one of my favorites that I will talk about all day long without anyone actually like prompting me. But that's a very like slice of life kind of story. There's a lot of depth to it in terms of like the emotion and the humor and the characters. So yeah, comics definitely have a lot to offer in terms of a good story. But speaking of
Absolutely. I
which,
always say it's a medium, it's not a genre, right?
exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
Dan Clowes's Eight Ball was something I read all the time. It was also, you can do anything with this genre, with this medium. Oh, I blew it. You can you can do anything with this medium, any genre. And I think, still, I'm at Comics Pro right now, and retailers are saying people are still coming into the store going, they still make comics? You mean comics aren't all superheroes? It's just something we got to fight. Like comics, a great story to, and these days is it's just a bonanza of independent
Hmm.
creators creating stories from all walks of life, any story you can imagine. I wish I had a million hours a day to read all the stuff that was out there,
You mean
because
both, buddy.
there's so much great stuff out there. We're having this renaissance, and people don't
Hmm.
get it. And I want to shake them and say, go to your local comic store and get it. Because there's
Exactly.
great stuff going
Exactly.
on. Yeah.
Well, speaking of which, this seems like a good segue to dive into Zicky, Wrath of the Rat King. This is a series that will be out very, very soon. Kind of made for like the younger audience. But walk us through what Zicky is all about.
So Zicky came out of a game I used to play with my kids. So I love playing kind of silly. We used to call them silly games with my kids, and I would pretend to be Zicky. I had the voice and everything, and I would tell them that when they woke up, that I would always go on adventures while they were asleep. And I would tell them about these adventures, and they would be like, "Yeah, yeah, you didn't do that." And they like to make fun of Zicky as if Zicky were their little brother. This annoying little brat of a kid, always trying to tell them stories that they didn't want to hear, or that they did want to hear, but they like to pretend they didn't want to hear. And so I just decided to bring Zicky to life. My kids are now like screenagers, and I do kind of miss those days of, where you could tell them anything, and the guardrails were off, in terms of storytelling and all of that. And so Zicky was kind of a love letter to that time in their life. But it also ended up just being super fun to write. So Zicky is, sorry, your question was, what is Zicky about? And I'm like putting myself on the therapist couch here. What Zicky is about is it's about a young boy who dreams he's a super secret ninja at night, goes on these missions, and then he sort of falls back into his bed in the morning, and he's just the little brother who's made fun of in the house. And my inspiration for this was Maurice Sendak's In the Night Kitchen, which was one of my favorite books, where Mickey falls out of his clothes back into bed at the end. What I did not realize was that Sendak was very influenced by Winsor McCay's Little Nemo and Slumberland. So that led me to Little Nemo, which is just the most brilliant series ever. But it has that vibe going on where you've got a little boy who's got this whole vibrant fantasy life, and then this real world that's, more typical and more about growing pains and more about parenting and more about getting along with your siblings. And, there's a lot of stuff in there, but it's all, I hope, fun. And madness rules, in both the real world and the manga world. And there's an ultimate bad guy other than just the Rat King, who ends up, wanting to eat cheese more than take over the world anyway. And and then eventually the manga creatures invade the real world, which was super fun. So I have two artists working on it. One artist did the manga world, one artist did the real world. And when we got to those pages, it was a lot of work. I was like, okay, so Jorge, you're gonna do the backgrounds, and then Zeno, you're gonna come in and add on top of it, and then Jorge, you're gonna go back and clean it up, or vice versa. But they were super good sports about it, and I think the result is great. It reminds me a little of when I was a kid. The Roger Rabbit movie, which was both, kind of a landmark, both live action and animation. And I wanted that kind of feel where the manga characters were, completely, drawn. And even the real world Jorge Gabota is got a great kind of loose, marvelous style. But I love the fact that these two universes collide, and they're not meant to integrate visually. They slam into each other. So anyway, that's a very long answer to what Zicky is about.
Yeah, no, and I really loved the art styles too, because like I'm just like a little ways into the story now, but I really dig like the dream world and the real world, and how there's those two very very different styles. Um, where did that particular idea come from? Did
Well, because Zicky was a ninja, I always wanted to do it as manga. I also think that, so this book is also kind of it's kind of a gateway. It's well, if I can be philosophical, it's a portal story, but the book itself is also kind of a portal book. So if you're a kid who's never read manga, you're going to be introduced to the art style of manga, which you're going to get to read left to right, and it's going to be a little more, friendly. But hopefully, a bunch of kids who read this book come out and say, I want to buy more manga. I want to read more manga. Conversely, people who read manga who maybe are not as into Western comics, the art style may draw them in, and it may open up that other world to them, right? Sort of a portal between the styles. And several people told me you can't do it. People have tried to mix manga and Western before, it doesn't work. And I was like, yeah, 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 whatever. I don't believe that. I'm sure it has worked. I'm sure there's just so much great stuff out there, but also this story demands it, right? And so Zicky really does ride on. I'm a huge fan of Japanese cinema, and so it does kind of ride on a Japanese cultural note here. And manga was just, perfect. In fact, I'm working on the sequel right now, and really the sequel leans harder into. It's called The Cursed Blade, and it leans harder into samurai stories and Japanese lore, and it just had to be manga. So it's manga.
there we go, there we
Yeah.
go. Now the team behind this is really, really amazing work. How did everyone come together?
Yeah, so finding artists is a large part of what I try to do.
Hmm.
Because there are so many artists out there worldwide, right? So now, like with the world we're in, you can work with artists anywhere, right? And so, I'm working with artists all over the world, Montreal and Italy and Germany, and actually, the new book I'm working on is with an artist who lives in my hometown, and we get together and we review drawings over beer, and I love that. But you can also, find people, and so it's really just a question of, doing the deep dive on social media. It's about when I go to cons, I spend a lot of time at Artist Alley. I've started going to more international cons, to try to find more international artists as well. And I'm just sort of always on the lookout for people I think are great, and then what book do they fit?
Hmm.
And so it's a lot of work to try to find the right person for the right story. But as soon as I saw Jorge's work, I was like, oh, he's the real world. That's exactly what I imagined, right? And Zeno, he goes by Zeno de Crux. His name is Aristu. He lives in Brazil. He is so amazing. He just can do anything. He's coloring another series for me because he's one of these people that's just a joy to work with. He can and will do anything, and I love him for it. But I also just think his style is the manga style is great, and it also a little bit bleeds into that Warner Brothers style from the 50s. There's definitely those frames where the characters' eyes are bulging out of their head, and that's less manga. That it's like definitely manga by way of Bugs Bunny. And I love that, right? So even the manga isn't straight up manga. It's kind of a because manga's become an international language now. So
Hmm.
it's manga inspired, but it's Zeno's work, and he's just marvelous. And I love the broad comedy. That also gets back to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's those tune expressions, right? That goes back to Warner Brothers, and there's a little bit of that in there as well, and that's awesome.
I love it. I love it. Um, One thing I also want to ask was the different themes in a story. Now, I read that you had themes of things like family, loyalty, imagination are kind of part of the story. How are those like woven into it?
Yeah, to me, imagination is king. And also Zicky is cheeky. He's likes to insult all of his enemies. It's kind of like all of the little insults he absorbs in the real world from his brother and sister, he turns around and throws back at the bad guys in the manga world, right? But there's definitely like a lot of it is about imagination, I guess, and family dynamics, right? Because we all know that having kids, is turns into chaos and children screaming at each other, and life goes on, right? And you got to work through those moments. You got to understand where they're coming from. You got to try to keep everyone on the same page. You got to keep everyone trying to be kind to each other when they can, and you move on, right? And so my wife and I are actually, I'm dad, like, so I based it on my family. Like my kids, Miles and Zoe, are Miles and Zoe in the book, and I'm drawn as the clueless but well-meaning dad. And we even put our dogs in there. So I think a lot of it is just about family dynamics and how we get through this age where kids are changing all the time, and there's kind of a steady stream of conflict and chaos, and yet how can that be managed, and how can everybody move forward, and then you throw into that this the imagination. And that's what I loved about it, Mickey in the Night Kitchen, or the Night Kitchen, Sendak's Night Kitchen, was just that kind of freewheeling. When Mickey goes to sleep, the world opens up and his imagination takes him in all these places that are sort of connected to the real world, but also fanciful, and I love that. So I referenced the Wizard of Oz, and there's so many Easter eggs in there. Like I have so many references that I threw in there for adults that are on the lookout for them. But it's that Wizard of Oz sense of imagination. Did Dorothy dream the whole thing? Everyone's there at the end, and you were there,
Hmm.
Scarecrow, and you were there, right? So it was kind of throwing all that up into a big pot and stirring it, and not trying to hit any of the themes too hard on the head because I want the book to ultimately be kind of fun and chaotic. I want kids to pick it up and read it because it's super fun. And if there's some thematic material coming at them sideways or under the covers a little bit, then that's great. But I never liked books that were really moralistic when I was a kid. That's why I loved The Cat in the Hat. It was pure chaos. The cat comes in and the house blows up, right? And then magically it's all put back together before mom gets home. That was more my inspiration than trying to hammer on, kind of a theme. Just kind of release the whirlwind and see what happens.
I like that. All right. Now, I imagine that there are a lot of listeners right now and viewers who have their own ideas for comics, who say, I have this idea, I've been like in the back of my head for a long time. What's your advice for just taking the idea and making it happen?
Yeah, there are so many ways now. So let's take an example of someone like me who has ideas but cannot draw their way out of a paper bag, right? You can still, do zines, right? If you go to, these comic festivals or small press festivals, and you go to the zine section, once again, a marvelous hotbed of creativity. People are writing these stories and writing them in their own way. They could be stick figures. It does not matter, because they're personal, right? It's somebody telling their own story, and it's all coming through. And so if you have no money to hire an artist and whatever, do a zine, right? Don't do AI. Please don't go on AI and
Seriously,
make your story,
never.
right? Never, right? Because it just what makes small press so great is the human factor. So
Hmm.
what makes the zines so great is they came out of the mind of often a single person, and it's that perspective and that gives it life, and beauty and all the other things that we read these things for. Even if the art's not great, and if you look at even something like Dog Man or Captain Underpants, those books aren't, I mean, they're great and the art is marvelous, but it's not well rendered, right? It's not like Dave Pilkey. Maybe he did, went to art school for 30 years and learned how to, shadow and render. And no, but they have, life, they have personality. And then on the other hand, if you can find an artist that you can collaborate with in, kind of a fair arrangement where you're both invested in it and you both share the fruits of your reward and you both putting in your sweat equity, and then not a lot of money has to exchange hands. But you can realize your vision and you can, like all the other creators up there, show up at Comic Cons and show up at whatever and hand people copies of your book and get it out there. The downside of there being so many great creators now is that you drown in a sea of content, right? So if you do go to a Comic Con, and you're at Artist Alley or wherever you are, there's 100 other people doing the same thing. And so, it's hard, right? You got to find that space. But if you're doing it for the love of doing it and doing it to find readers that appreciate what you're doing, you will be happy because you will A, do it, and B, find readers who appreciate what you're doing. And that's great. So yeah, the gates are kind of wide open if you want to walk through them.
I think that is a great problem to have because now you got all these new stories that before weren't really possible, back in like a certain like time period. So I think it's really cool that now it's like you can have all these different ideas and different art styles and different stories being told. So for me, like as like a longtime comics lover, I feel like it's a pretty exciting time actually because there's so much new
Extremely
stuff to
exciting.
discover.
Yeah,
Very
I
much so.
totally agree. And the flip side of that is don't just go to a Comic Con to give away or sell your stuff. Go to a Comic Con to meet other artists. Comics
Exactly.
creators are the coolest people, right? I tell you, I've been to a lot of festivals and film festivals, and I've been to a lot of Comic Cons. Comic creators are great. As my daughter used to say, comic creators rule and filmmakers drool, right? Filmmakers are all competitive and, you know,
I love
I
it.
mean,
I
filmmakers are
love it.
great too, but it can be great too. But it's a different vibe.
Hmm.
Comic creators are just like wide open. Come on into this crazy tent of ours and let me show you around and let me help you and let me introduce you to a few people. And there's an openness and a welcoming quality to the community in comics that you don't find. I haven't found in many other places. So yeah, get your butt over to a Comic-Con, go to Artist Alley, meet people, and maybe you'll find your next collaborator. Actually,
There you go.
San Diego does this great, and I'm sure they do it at other cons. They do a speed dating thing for artists and writers, which is marvelous, right? So you sit at a table. The artists are the very attractive people that we all want to be with, and the writers are the less than attractive people who are trying to find a date. So there are many, many, many more writers than artists. But so oftentimes you are sitting alone at a table for the 5-minute session. But as an artist, like the writers just come and they come up to you.
Yeah, exactly,
It's great.
exactly.
As a writer, you go and you get to sit down and look at people's portfolio and talk to them about what they're interested in. And in 5 minutes, you move on, and it's great. That I love that. That's like one of my favorite things at Comic-Con.
I love it too, very much so. All right. Well, Shawn, we are coming down to the end of this conversation, but the last question to wrap it all up, what's next for SHP?
Yeah, we have a lot of stuff going on. So we've got the Tales of the Macabre, which is the horror anthology I talked about. I'm working on the Zicky sequel, Zicky and the Cursed Blade. I am working on the Woodstock sequel and conclusion, Woodstock 99, which takes place in the fiery mosh pits of and the train wreck that was Woodstock 99. So if you haven't seen one of the documentaries on Woodstock 99, go watch them because wow.
Yep.
It's crazy. I'm working on a new horror sci-fi with a guy named Jack Purcell, DC Marvel, who lives in my hometown, and we sit around and drink Guinness and look at pages, and he's wonderful. And that's going to be super fun. It's sort of a take on the Cassandra myth with a twist, and that one's going to be really cool. So yeah, we have a lot of irons in the fire. The next books are Beowulf, which is a spin on the Beowulf legend. That's going to be sort of June on shelves, and the sci-fi horror is going to be like August on shelf, and then we're going to go right into Woodstock 99. So lots of stuff.
I love it. I love it. And of course, you can get your copy of Zicky and Zicky Wrath of the Rat King. It's coming out on March 10th. So you can.
It is actually now coming out on April 14th.
April 14th. Okay, April
Screwed
14th.
up. This is what happens with small press. I didn't get enough lead time to my printer.
All right.
So I'm also like I'm also like the dog catcher and everything else. And so, yes, I screwed up the printing. April 14th.
All right. Well,
but
you can still
you can pre-order
your copy. You go to shpcomics.com. Everything is there. Get your copy of Zicky pre-ordered. While you're there, check out the other titles. There's so many cool things to explore. Read about the artists, some amazing, amazing talent. And Shawn, thank you once again for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been really fun. Appreciate it.
Right. And for the listeners at home, thank you once again for checking out Citywide Bytes. I'm your host, Max Bowen, and we'll see you all next time.